to let everybody load into the session before we get started. So if you'll just be patient with us, we'll be getting started shortly. Good morning to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a few seconds to let everyone load into the Zoom room, we will get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to WITA. I am Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of WITA, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. We have a slew of new programming in the works that we hope to announce in the coming days, including events on trade and gender, trade and the environment, and what does a worker-centric trade agenda look like? And next week, we have one of our signature events on tap, a look at the 2021 Congressional Trade Agenda with the 4 key staffers heading up the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees. As in past years, that event is off the record. So if you want to know what the 4 councils have to say, you have to be in the Zoom room where it happens, as there won't be a recording or a YouTube broadcast of that event. Today, we have a terrific event planned, but before we get to our panel, we'd like to continue one of our favorite traditions, calling out the names of some of those you are in community with at today's event, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Andrew Rudman with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Laura Boffman with the Trade Partnership, Ken Engel with Schneider Electric, and Lee Shockey with the Drexel Chemical Company. Thank you, Andrew, Laura, Ken, and Lee for joining us, and welcome to all of you. If you registered for today's event on Zoom, you should have received an email with today's event program and biographies for our speakers. We also let you ask questions for our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to some of those at the tail end of our session. Many of you know Nate Herman, the Senior Vice President for Policy at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, who is a friend of many in the WITA community. But we're also pleased to welcome several new speakers to the WITA Zoom platform. Karyn Booth with Thompson Hine LLP and General Counsel to the National Industrial Transportation League, the nation's oldest and largest shipper organization. Dr. Noel Hacegaba, Deputy Executive Director and COO of the Port of Long Beach, the 2nd largest port in the United States. Weston LaBar, Chief Executive Officer, the Harbor Trucking Association, a coalition which serves all the major West Coast ports, including Long Beach, Los Angeles, Oakland, and Seattle-Tacoma. And our moderator, LaRocco of CNBC, and author of Trade War, Containers Don't Lie, Navigating the Bluster. Lorianne, I'm going to count on you to navigate the bluster and help our audience understand what the heck is going on at the ports. Lorianne?
Thank you so much, Ken, for having me. And I am so excited to start this. For those who know me, I am a trade wonk. I love it. And when I kicked off my book for Trade War, I'm going to show you a graphic that I'm going to show you now. And folks, what you're looking at right now is a live look at trade. Your toilet paper, your Bounty, your Chaise Lounge, your stove, it's in there. And this is the reason why we are here. And honestly, when you see all these ships, and if you kind of look at the West Coast, you can see why there might be a little bit of congestion out there. So when we're looking at that 90% of everything in your home comes on a vessel, now more than ever, as we are living in this pandemic, we know and we have felt the effects of the pandemic. And now, unfortunately, with the congestion. As I say, you know, the global trade is a forward-looking indicator, and it's a historical marker in terms of where we're going and where we are and where we have come. What I wanted to show you, in addition to marine traffic, and just for folks out there who don't know, every vessel has their own GPS monitor, and that's why marine traffic is able to identify where the vessels are. When you look at a vessel known as the APL Charleston, I've got some great graphics here to show you how one vessel, this vessel right here is telling you the story where Noel is going to dive into. But this vessel itself, where you see like the little circles, that shows you that their waiting pattern, their holding pattern. Back in December, from December from December 22nd to January 2nd, that one vessel, which contained over 200,000 containers of Peloton products, had to wait to get into the port of Los Angeles. Well, the vessel is back, and it has been anchored since February 18th, still waiting to get into the port of LA for yet another unloading. It's really the hurry up and wait, if you will, the deja vu that the APL Charleston is feeling, as well as all these other vessels. So let's get right to it, and let's bring in Noel to talk to us about what insight he can give us into the delays and what is going on. Good morning, Noel.
Good morning, Lorianne. A pleasure to join you and my fellow colleagues here. What you described is a great illustration of a supply chain that is still adjusting to the rapid shift in market conditions. Just to take a step back and provide some additional context, when you look at cargo trends in 2020, you'll notice the tale of two halves. We went from steep declines of cargo to sharp gains in the second half of the year, from record blank sailings to record extra loaders. In short, we went from doom and gloom to fast and furious on a turn of the dime. So what you're seeing, and the illustration that you presented just a moment ago, illustrates a supply chain that is still adjusting to these shifts. We have the combination of tighter capacity, the record surge, it's overwhelming the system. And as you can see, when you look at how many days on average a container sits in a terminal, we call that dwell time. And what you see here on the slide is a historical view of dwell time at the ports in Southern California over the past year. You'll notice that for the first half of the year, it was averaging about 2.5 days, which is in line with normal operations. But then in the second half of the year, you saw that dwell time inch up to 3 days, and eventually it hit 5 days in December. I'm just going to tell you right now, it's in no one's interest to have containers sitting in a container terminal for that long. Terminals will tell you that they are not warehouses, but the tightened capacity in the actual warehouses is what's keeping containers in the terminals longer. And with containers spending more time inside the terminal, it tightens the terminal's capacity, which is a reason you see ships at anchorage waiting for a berth to call. So this phenomenon that we know as vessel bunching in the industry is a reason that you have what you described, a hurry up and wait. Now, this is precisely the reason why the Port of Long Beach made available 40 acres of land at the port on a temporary basis. We call this Pier Store at Pier S, and it's a short-term overflow resource to provide immediate relief to our terminals and get those containers out of the terminal as quickly as possible. And what you see here is the image of Store in its origins, at its beginnings. Within days, we were able to accommodate thousands of containers. On the next slide, you'll see some more images of this operation at work. This site gives our retail partners greater control and flexibility in delivering containers to warehouses and distribution centers. And many shippers are already making good use of it. In fact, you'll see a couple more images in a moment. Store's business hours align with the marine container terminals. It's also a fully wheeled operation, which ensures that containers are ready to roll at a moment's notice. Turn times between terminals and store are between 12 and 17 minutes, and dual transactions make up nearly 80 to 90% of activity. I know this is a lot of detail, but I mention this because it demonstrates not just the heightened demand for a relief valve like this, but it also shows the market demand for this, and it's working very well. And that's what we're doing, Lorianne. That's just one of the many things that we're doing as a port to help bring those ships to berth and help bring those containers to the supply chain.
You know, and it's great that you're lucky enough to have that real estate, right, to be able to move the containers. But one of the critical pieces of the supply chain is the human capital, the people, the longshoremen, the truckers, the warehouse workers. Unfortunately, in the state of California, these essential workers are now finally getting shots in arms. Can you talk to us the critical nature it is for the government to really kind of step in there, if you will, to get these vaccinations? It's on my understanding that you've had over 800 people from the Port of Los Angeles that have caught COVID-19. Can you talk to us about the essential need to having a healthy workforce and what can be done to kind of keep that flowing? Because without people, nothing's moving.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you for raising that question, Lorianne. That's, if you were to ask me what keeps me up at night, it's precisely that. It's making sure our workforce is healthy. Our workforce has demonstrated from day one of the pandemic that they're willing to roll up their sleeves, wash their hands, mask up, go to the docks and do their job. We have not shut the port any single day throughout the pandemic, but it's vital that we keep our workforce healthy. It's vital that we prioritize them for the vaccination. Just in recent days, we got some good news from the state of California and our own city in Long Beach. They worked out an agreement to start vaccinating our dock workers. And to date, 3,000 doses have been allocated for our workforce, for our waterfront workers. We need more, of course, and we're continuously working with the state, with the county, with our city, advocating at all levels of government, because as you said, Lorianne, the health of our economy depends on our health of our workers. And we need to make sure that our dock workers are healthy and ready to go to work. We need them now more than ever. We've got 30 ships at anchorage. We need to move those ships to berth and those containers into the supply chain.
Exactly. And let's bring in Weston LaBar here. Weston, you know, if it wasn't for the trucker and for the intricate the intricate web, if you will, of the trucking industry, no one would be getting anything because you're vital here. But unfortunately, the truckers are not getting the shots in arms. Tell us from your perspective, how do we, about this loss of money and productivity from your industry and how that trickles down?
Yeah, well, I think everybody knows we have a national truck driver shortage in America. And you can say the old adage, if someone bought it, a trucker brought it. And quite frankly, I'm glad to see our dock workers getting vaccinated, but the fact that truckers are still being treated as second-class citizens. And while I know Noel and the port administrations are working very hard to get them included, as usual, we feel like we're left behind. And the health and well-being of our workforce is essential, not just to the ports, not just to the state economy, but really to the national and global economy, because they are the backbone, they are the fabric that helps every business be able to work. And if they're essential enough to deliver medical supplies, PPE, and yes, vaccines, they should be essential enough to get them. But yes, let's pivot, because data and metrics are what's really driving our industry. It's been a shift since I started in this position in 2014 to be able to utilize data and metrics more. And we've had such great partnerships with the marine terminals, with the port authorities, and with other stakeholders to try to use data to work smarter. If you look here, what we look at as two key metrics are turn times and dual transactions, and they really lead to the amount of turns per shift. So in the first Clean Trucks program, that was 2007, 2008, prior to the mega vessels, prior to the vessel alliances, when the first Clean Trucks program went into effect, the industry said we need at least 3+ turns to be able to pay for those trucks and to be able to properly compensate our workforce. Simple math. In 2013, we hovered just above 2 turns, 2.3 turns, data that we got from our members based on their transportation management software back then. In 2020, some of our members had less than a turn, but the industry average from our membership was about 1.1 turns, meaning they didn't even get, in many cases, a full container in, container out per shift with their workforce. That leads to a capacity crunch, which again leads to some of the things Noel's talking about, an inability to move containers off dock to create space to move empty containers back on dock. Turn times, we said, we've been consistent. We need a 60-minute turn time for a container in, container out. That's what we call a dual transaction. And in 2013, again, just before shipping alliances, just before mega vessels, we saw an average across all terminals in LA Long Beach at 68 minutes. And we use this because the vessel alliances have really fundamentally changed the way we need to do business. They're bigger, and instead of having a blue box on a blue ship coming to a blue terminal, it's an Easter egg hunt. And since July 2020, since the uptick in the pandemic, we've seen an average across all terminals of 80 minutes. And that goes from the terminals that are operating at a 40-minute average to the terminals that are operating over 2 hours on average. And dual transactions, again, is such an important part, because to be able to use one truck to take a container into and then pick up and take a container out of a marine terminal is an essential part of the operation. You don't want to have 2 trucks to handle 1 container or 2 trucks to handle 2 containers. 1 truck should be able to do that. Our desired standard is over 80%. We know we can't get to 100%, but back in 2013, all of our members reported over 80% of their fleet being able to do dual transactions. In 2020, it was under 20%, and in some cases around 10% at some marine terminals. I do want to thank the port authorities. I know the Port of Long Beach has worked with their stakeholders, their marine terminals, to say we need to get to above 50% threshold. And I think that's the first step. And they've been working very hard. And to my understanding, almost all the terminals have gotten not just there, but many have gotten over that 80% threshold. And the Port of LA and created a turn time incentive program. And the only way you're eligible to get the incentive of increasing better turn times is to have a floor of 50% dual transaction. So these metrics are key to be able to assure the health and well-being of our entire port ecosystem.
When you're looking at the port ecosystem and you're looking at these dual transactions where, you know, you want to get paid as a trucker, you want to get paid, you want to get your job done, and you want to be efficient at it so you can get paid. I am talking to truckers, logistics individuals, where they have to have two trucks, one to sit in line for 4 hours to drop off an empty container, and then they have another truck go pick one up. When you're looking at this ripple effect, when you're looking at the concrete that this is creating, this actually impacts the importers, the retailers. They need to fill the shelves. I've been talking to retailers from all kinds where the weight of getting their material, okay, it would take normally 25 to 30 days. It's now in upwards of 75 to 80 days. That is a long time. That is a long time for logistics management. And this is why we are here, folks. How can you plan when there is no reliability? There's no reliability in this system right now. And that's why we're here. So you have these great minds coming together, telling you the problem, but more importantly, we're going to give you solutions. But before we get to that, I want to bring in Nate, because Nate, you have a membership. Talk to the audience here about your membership and how this concrete of containers is impacting the retail industry and the consumer, and how are they trying to navigate through uncertainty?
Thanks, Laurie, and thanks for WITA for having me here today. So yeah, you bring up a point. I'll just go quickly through the process of what does it mean for apparel and footwear and accessory brands and retailers who are our members. So the problems start overseas. So most of our product comes from Asia, most of the clothes, shoes, and accessories that you wear every day, and much of the personal protective equipment, the face masks, the surgical gowns that are critical during COVID are coming from Asia, and that our members produce those. And so what happens is overseas, we can't get access to a container. So we have an appointment to get on a ship, or a product to get on a ship, but we can't get a container to do this. And so what's happened, even though we have contracts in place with ocean carriers to ship our product at a certain time, we make an appointment, we can't get the container unless we're willing to pay anywhere from 2, 3, 4 times that contract rate. So we have our first unexpected, unplanned for cost that we now have to pay for. And even when we're willing to pay those costs, in many cases, our containers get rolled, which means that we are kicked off the ship that we were trying to get on, and now we're going to have to wait for the next ship, which might come a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week later. And so that's the first problem that we're experiencing. In the past, what we've done to try and accelerate shipments is move that product to air cargo. Air cargo is usually a lot more expensive, 10 to 15 times the cost of moving product through ocean cargo. But when you're trying to get a product to market, you sometimes do that. Well, obviously there's a big problem with air cargo over the last year because passenger airlines have flown many fewer flights. And we've seen a huge hit on airlines. Airlines account for 60% of the air cargo capacity. And so we can't really go to them, or we're going to have to pay, again, exorbitant rates, which were already 10 to 15 times higher than ocean cargo rates. And so we haven't had that. So say we get on a ship that finally comes into San Pedro Bay. 40% of the clothes and shoes and accessories that come in the United States come through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And so they're sitting in San Pedro Bay. And then we have the problem that Noel talked about, 30 ships sitting out in Anchorage. We have the problems that Weston talked about. Even if the ships come to berth and unload the cargo, we can't access the cargo And so we have our truckers who are sitting there waiting an entire shift just to get one container out of there and haven't even been able to bring a cargo in. And then, of course, it creates that kind of backup that Weston talked about. So we can't get our empties back in, our empty containers back in, which creates this vicious circle that because we can't get empties back in, that means there's no empties available in Asia, and the whole cycle starts again. So we have costs up front that were unexpected. We have incredible delays when it comes into the United States, which leads to additional costs because we're missing deadlines for retail customers. And so the retail customers will either cancel orders outright or charge us for every day that we're late on an order. And so we're talking about immense charges, we're missing delivery times. We're talking about seasonal product in many cases. We're trying to bring in product now for spring, and if the product doesn't come in, we're gonna miss the whole spring season. And that product, we can't sell it in summer or fall because it's meant for spring, it's meant for Easter, it's meant for other spring specific season. And then again, we're paying additional charges here because we can't get the cargo off. So we're getting charged demurrage charges. We can't get the empties back in. So we're charged detention charges. And so we're getting hit with new charges, new costs, delays in every step. And so we're talking about huge new costs and possibly not us getting product in when we're supposed to and empty shelves.
You know, I want to show the audience here. I'm lucky where I get to know a lot of CEOs, and I had the opportunity to break down the numbers here on a product we all know, the sanitation wipes, the wipes that we are wiping down our entire house. These are coveted, it's worth gold. The next slide I want to show you in terms of this, you would think that this CEO is making money hand over fist. Karyn, I want to bring you in because, you know, you work with clients, you're working through the nitty gritty. Folks, I'm going to let you look at the differences. I took the CEO here through present day versus only 180 days ago. You know, Nate talked about the costs. Do you know now that these retailers, these importers, they have to pay a $300 deposit in order to participate in reserving a container? That is a brand new charge. Now you have to pay to even try to play, and that's try to play. That $300 does not guarantee you a container. You know, when you look at the price differences between manufacturing the wipes, any type of wipe that is supposed to kill COVID has to be made in the United States, the formula. So these individuals are using the container system twice. They got to try to export the product out and get the finished product back in. Karyn, when you look at these numbers, what are your clients telling you? Folks, this guy his revenues are down 90%. They are down a total of 90% because of all these extra costs. He sells sanitation wipes. What is going on here? Karyn, come on in.
Sure, Lori, thanks so much, and good morning, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. And, you know, as Lori said, you know, unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, you know, every pricer, you know, brings in some of the lawyers, which is where I come in, and I focus on, you know, the supply chain aspect of transportation and logistics. And I do represent both importers and exporters who are really hurting right now, as you're hearing across the board. And, you know, as I see this, you know, and as they see it, and what I hear from my clients is, you know, this is really kind of the perfect storm. There are multiple problems across the supply chain. You know, they start in one place and then they ripple into other links in the chain, as we've heard the other panelists talk about. But what you're highlighting here, Lori, on the cost, you know, that's really where, you know, they're kind of feeling it the most right now. When you have these market disruptions, that's the first thing that happens. Things get thrown into chaos and the costs start rising, tick, 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 not in one category, but across the board. We are seeing ocean freight costs on imports as high as anyone can even remember for decades. So, you know, folks have contracts. That's how most of the product gets moved. And they're frankly just, these contract terms are just getting ignored. And the challenge is when you're in the middle of a crisis, you really don't have time to take somebody to court and do all this. You are trying to get access to your product. That's priority number one. And so parties are willing to kind of throw the contract out the window, at least initially, to make sure that they can try to get their cargo. But we're seeing it on the freight cost side. Laura, you mentioned the container charges. This is affecting both importers and exporters. And I'll talk about exporters in a minute. Nate talked about the congestion at the ports and sort of the backup, both in the warehousing costs, because there's not enough capacity there to move containers coming into the West Coast ports to storage, which is then backing up, at the ports and the terminals. And this leads to those demurrage charges and detention charges that Nate touched on. And these rack up quick. This is not an insignificant problem. And again, it's just another layer of added cost that wasn't predicted at the outset of when you entered into this contract, which creates instability and problems. And of course, let's not forget business interruption, lost sales. Those are consequential damages from the legal perspective. Those are hard to recover, but obviously are going to have tremendous impacts on the companies that I'm dealing with. So, I want to also just raise the issue of exporters, because their challenges are just as great and a little bit different, because we've got this incredible demand in China for the boxes that are coming into the US loaded, are getting eventually moved when they can, and then you have an empty, and the exporters need access to those empties, and they're just not getting them. There are equipment imbalance issues. There are incentives in the market, in the commercial market, for ocean carriers to move empties back to China as fast as possible in some respects to maximize, frankly, the higher freight rates they're getting on imports. The freight rates on exports are lower. And so there is a little bit of a disincentive there to move containers for the carriers and others to pay those costs, because the exporters are not always located, in the city locations or where the unloading has happened for the importers. So that's sort of another complexity to this. And so they're not getting the boxes. When they do get a box, they're having trouble, like you heard from Nate, getting on the ships. They may have booked a sailing and suddenly that booking gets canceled. Now they have to wait another 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks to get on another ship. So you can just see how this problem is compounded. It's obviously hitting folks really hard on the cost side, but let's not forget inefficiencies, right? There are additional costs to the whole network in the inefficiencies that we're hearing about. And, we're going to talk about some solutions in a minute, but I guess the last thing I'll say, Lori, is, this is a complex problem. This is not something that is sort of easy to pinpoint, one little link in the chain, because of these ripple effects and the way that the business gets done. The contractual relationships are all very different. The importers and exporters contract with the ocean carriers or middlemen, but the terminals contract only with the ocean carriers. Labor contracts with the ports and the terminals. The draymen, Weston can speak to this, his members are contracting with everybody, the ocean carriers, the importers, exporters, etc. So there's a lot of finger pointing also taking place, where no one's really taking responsibility. There's always somebody else. There's so many players, that people get blamed. So, I could kind of go on and on here, but, it really is a complex problem with, lots of impacts here on cost and efficiencies.
And what this boils down to is United States GDP. Back in January, I broke the story on how the carriers were actively denying U.S. ag exports in favor of the empties. And for the individuals out there who don't understand the cycle of the container, ag exports they're a dirty product. They're a cheap product. They go out for like $800. Meanwhile, and they're slower to unload. It's cheaper for the carrier to put on an empty, which is easier to cycle through the system. So they can eat that $800 that they would get paid for if they put on the US ag. On the flip side, they're getting an upwards of $7,500 to $8,000 per container. So it makes sense why the carriers are doing it. It's a business decision. But in the end, it's US GDP. You've got manufacturers getting squeezed at the margins because they cannot go to Target saying, hey, buddy, my sanitation wipes are up 40% to make. Can you increase the price? Walmart and Target are not going to do that. They got a fixed price. There's no pandemic clause. Oscar, you went before Congress 2 weeks ago. Let's all jump in here right now and let's talk about solutions. US competitiveness. It all hinges on a healthy economy, and that is based on trade. Free trade and trade that moves. It's reciprocal trade. We are not seeing that right now. You are seeing congestion. Oscar, you have some great, I'm saying Oscar here. Oh, goodness gracious. Noel, you have some great ideas here to talk about the capital investment. You mentioned this before Congress. This is not new news. Why is the government not doing anything? And now, based on our solutions here that are realistic and not pie in the sky, can they get done? And if so, when? I leave it to you, Noel.
Your question is very timely. I'm optimistic that there are a couple factors that I think will open the door for solutions. One is we have a new administration that has already signaled their serious interest in investing in our infrastructure, supporting trade and ports. Secondly, we're in the middle of a crisis, and let's face it, sometimes it takes a crisis to get attention that leads to swift action. Let's begin with the biggest picture I can begin with. It's important to recognize that goods movement is literally the economy in motion. And during my testimony before Congress, I noted that investing in the supply chain is an investment in the US economy, as you just pointed out. And I believe that Congress wants to help. They just need our help to understand how they can do so. Let me give you just a few ideas. One is increasing funding for infrastructure projects. US businesses, and Karyn pointed this out, US businesses on average spend $27 billion each year in extra freight costs due to congestion and outdated facilities. And the total cost to meet freight infrastructure needs is estimated at $3.7 trillion. So we need significant investments to improve the flow of freight across the supply chain to drive velocity and reliability, enhance our place in the global market, and also increase the standard of living for Americans. In addition to more funding, we need to make sure that these infrastructure investments are strategically placed. That's why we continue to support the development of a comprehensive national freight policy that takes a holistic view of the supply chain instead of piecemealing and investing in some parts of the freight system at the expense of others. We got to remember that congestion anywhere in the supply chain will slow down the movement of cargo across the system. So what we need is an integrated planning and funding system that addresses the end-to-end needs of the freight movement system and will be critical to developing a comprehensive regional and statewide plan. What we also need, and I think, by the way, that the FAST Act, which was recently enacted by Congress, I think was a good start. It looked at expanding funding, streamlining the environmental review and permitting processes, promoting deployment of transportation technologies. I think a good start also, which I would strongly recommend, and I recommended to the Senate committee that I testified before, is the formation of a multimodal freight office that would report directly to the Secretary of Transportation. Why? Because you need someone that has the bigger picture in mind, that understands the connection points and connects freight and transportation to the US economy. The last thing I'll say is, as much as we need to invest in our physical infrastructure, we need to start investing in our data highways. The entire supply chain is relying more heavily on data. We need data to flow in order to get the containers to flow more efficiently. We need to get Congress to start paying attention to that and looking at ways to start funding data highways in addition to physical infrastructure.
Now, Weston, if you can briefly talk about the data sharing, you're actively in part of the LA Port Optimizer, right? Where there is data sharing available. The problem is, though, not everybody likes to share. So from a national basis, how can we get this done? But more importantly, how that improves the efficiency? Like, why, knowing everything, all the puzzle pieces coming together, why?
Well, obviously, Lorianne, the more information you have, the more advanced planning you can do with strong predictive analytics. You can start to predict the future. And what we've been leading is really integration efforts, getting stakeholders to use application program interface integrations, APIs, to start sharing data in real time. What we felt like from day one, the biggest opportunity for something like the Port Optimizer was to be a data hub. And I still think that that's really what's needed. Somebody who can aggregate the data through integration and push it back out to allow people to do advanced planning. That's the part that we're missing today. And the industry, because of that, is so reactive. I agree with everything that Noel said. The only thing I'd add is, in addition to the digital infrastructure, creating more robust connectivity and the Internet of Things to use advanced data points, and in some cases, be able to collect data when people don't want to share them. We also need to look at the inland infrastructure to make sure that we have the necessary infrastructure to move those containers from the port to someplace else. And I think more and more, especially on the West Coast, we see municipalities cracking down on inland developments that really hurts the port. The city of Long Beach, for instance, tried to shut down a major overweight corridor and turn it into a park for their plan of the future, while the Port of Long Beach is talking about growth. So we need to make sure that our infrastructure plans align. We need to make sure that data and digital infrastructure is a huge key component of that. And I think the most immediate thing we can do, and then I'll turn it back over, is around workforce development. It's first getting our workforce back there. I don't want to harp on this, but you can't harp on it enough. Vaccines. Get the entire supply chain vaccinated, because we have a worker shortage that is structural and systemic, and we've eroded it because of COVID. And then we need to look at long-term advanced planning in the form of robust workforce development to get people into our industry through pipelines, and then create policy reform that actually incentivizes the movement of cargo. I would argue today that the ocean alliances have no incentive to actually move cargo. They make money whether it sits still or it moves. And that's why our biggest initiative is to reform the Shipping Act and reform policies like the Uniform Intermodal Interchange Agreement, which Karyn knows so much about. But really, those are three of the major things that we need to do in addition to investing in our technology and our infrastructure.
Karyn, let's get in here. If you can go briefly, because I do want to get Nate in to kind of summarize in the end their action plan, right? How this will help them. So Karyn, briefly tell us your solutions.
Well, look, I think that, again, the complexity of this issue means there's going to need to be short-term solutions and long-term solutions. And certainly I know, my clients are desperate for some short-term solutions. And as I look at it, that means we've got to look at both commercial considerations, using your relationships, your partners that you have for information, forwarders to help you with that. And this gets to perhaps, Lori, your points about the lack of enough transparency in the supply chain today. So you're going to need to depend on your partners for that information. Commercial solutions also, looking at your contracts. As I said earlier, people are not being strict about enforcement, but my view of that is pay attention to what your terms are. And if you have damages, document those. You're not going to focus on that right now, but it might be something you're going to need down the road as leverage in a future negotiation. But I also think one more commercial point is, supply chain vulnerabilities. Each importer and exporter is going to have to do that evaluation of their supply chain and identify where that weakness is. Do you have enough carriers in your mix in your portfolio? Where are you sourcing your material on the import side? Can you move that around so that you're not kind of locked into one particular trade line? And issues such as that. Also, there's a role for government here. We heard about that from Noel, but the Federal Maritime Commission has jurisdiction over these issues. They are really the regulators over international ocean transportation. They regulate the ocean carriers and the marine terminals. They don't really regulate the importers and exporters. The FMC has done a good job. They've been out in front on sort of the detention and demurrage charges we heard about. But now they have expanded their look into these issues because of the current crisis. They just issued some orders that they're going to be seeking information from their regulated parties to try to understand better whether or not there could even be enforcement problems here. Frankly, that's a little bit of a longer term play. And I think there's at least some folks who would like to see them get more out in front and more vocal, maybe even hold a hearing on these issues so that we could bring the leaders of the industry together. And I know Commissioner Dye has done a really good job in the past putting together supply chain innovation teams where industry leaders come together and try to tackle these difficult challenges, across the supply chain, where they're face to face with her. She's, getting them questions and issues. And I think, that's really needed here.
Nate, what do you think your final thoughts here?
So we still have the immediate problem, and we agree with all these solutions. And we need the data sharing and the transparency that Weston was talking about. We need the infrastructure that Noel was talking about. We need people to be reviewing their contracts, as Karyn was talking about, and getting the Federal Maritime Commission engaged. But all those take time, and the issue is we have the problem now. So we need solutions for the future so that we don't have these problems again. The issue is how do we deal with it now? And that's the problem that our members are seeking. We need this product now. We're trying to bring in spring orders. We'll soon be bringing in summer stuff for summer. How can we guarantee that's going to happen? And that's the difficult part that we haven't quite figured out, because our usual solutions are not working. But we do strongly support data sharing, transparency, infrastructure. We've worked hard on that in the past, and we'll work hard on that again. And we're coming into contract season for next year. That'll be very important, as Karyn said, to make sure that we have the right provisions in those contracts, so that we don't have the same problem with ocean carriers again going forward.
And to let the audience know, based on the containers, based on the bills of lading and customs, we still have Christmas trees, Christmas products still coming into the ports. So Nate what he's saying is in fact true. Containers don't lie. And so, I'll end it there and bring back Ken.
Thank you, Lorianne, and thanks to the panel. Really informative, really grateful for all of you. We have a lot of questions that have come in. And Nate, I'm going to actually just stick with you for a minute, if we can. Russell from the Commerce Department asked about the lack of container availability in foreign ports for exporting products to the U.S. Are the large exporters having the same quantity problems with carriers as the spot exporters are having getting on those containers? And Nate, you're mute. There you go. Thank you.
We're seeing problems across the board with our large members or small members, brands, retailers. It doesn't seem to matter. There are some arguments that the larger retailers have some more capacity, but everybody across the board seems to be impacted by this. It's an equal opportunity problem, I guess it would be the best way to say it. And the one last thing to bring into this with the availability of containers, there is also an issue with the manufacturers of the containers themselves and them ramping up to fill the scarcity, the shortage of containers. And there's issues with that as well that we don't have time to discuss here, but that's another problem.
And as sort of a related question that sort of pivots a little bit, are some of the problems in supply chains not only that there's been a shift in consumer demand, but actually the disease itself how is that affecting the overseas manufacturers and their ability to fulfill orders, and how is that having an impact on the ports? And then get to a question maybe for Noel as well about COVID vaccines. But Nate, maybe you again, I'm not sure if that's you. I see Weston's nodding as well. Maybe he wants to jump in.
I'll let Nate
go ahead, Weston.
Yeah. All right. Well, I've never turned down the opportunity to speak. So no, I mean, we see it both domestically and overseas, right? The beginning of this entire issue was because we didn't have enough workforce because of COVID-related issues. And because of that, shippers played catch up. And we're going to continue to see these issues as long as our economy stays strong and the predominant way of consumption is e-commerce. It really complicates the supply chain because you're trying to take that product essentially from as fast as you can from the manufacturer to the home. And that makes it difficult when you have congestion everywhere. We see it on the manufacturing side, both internationally and domestically. We've seen issues around social distancing that complicated issues, especially around municipal policy here in California. If you were in one city, you could have certain workers. If you were in another city, you couldn't. So streamlining that policy was super important. And then obviously, as I said, we have a crunch on our workforce that is structural and systemic. And when you have some sort of erosion, when you see 10 to 20% of your workforce go away because either they're sick, they have close contact tracing, which disqualifies them from being eligible, or the fact that maybe they're uncomfortable. Much of our workforce, truck drivers, the average age is in their mid-50s. So those are high-risk individuals, again, that should be vaccinated. And it has put a crunch at every level of the supply chain at a time when you're trying to figure out how to get something from point A to point B. Look at it as a demand chain as opposed to a supply chain.
So,
And the other,
and I want to, go ahead, Nate, go ahead.
So the other component on that is the rise of e-commerce, which has been the saving grace in large part for our industry over the last year, the explosion in e-commerce. But that also makes the supply chain infinitely more complicated. You're not just sending it to 10 stores, you're sending product to 1,000 end consumers. And so that makes it much more complicated. So I just want to add that as well.
Interesting wrinkle, Nate. We're all taking advantage of that electronic commerce opportunity, but you're right, it's not something we think about. If we're not going to a Gap store, but instead buying online, it's changing the way product moves. Noel, if I may, just to follow up on this vaccine question a little bit, and God, obviously we know that this is something for everybody who's watching this webinar. It's for everyone in America and around the world, obviously, access to the vaccine. But one of the questions comes from Richard Wannerman, asks an interesting question, Noel, about mariners and sort of an invisible workforce in a sense, in that they don't have a home in many cases. What can be done to get U.S. mariners getting access, or not U.S., all mariners, they're traveling around the world. We certainly don't want them to be carriers of the vaccine. What can be done to get them vaccines as well to help keep the workforce stable?
Well, I think the use of the word invisible is a good one here, right? Because for most people, the supply chain in general is invisible until something doesn't work, right? And that's why we're having this discussion. But I would agree with what Weston said earlier. As a port authority, we have been advocating from day one that we need to vaccinate our entire workforce. Our dock workers are beginning to get vaccinated. We're super happy about that. But we've got truck drivers, we've got rail operators, we've got pilots, and we also have, as you said, our seamen and women who are on these ships. And I think this is going to require some extraordinary collaboration at all levels of government and even overseas, right? Because we need to ensure that the workforce across the supply chain is safe, they're healthy, they're protected. We will continue to advocate in Long Beach for all of our transportation workers at all levels of government, whether it's our city, our county, our state, and the federal government. We need to prioritize them. If we want to get out of this crisis, as Nate said, he and his members are relying on us to fix things now and not come up with solutions over the long haul. If we want to make a dent now, we need to make sure that our workforce is safe, and we'll continue to fight for that.
So,
Ken,
go ahead, Laura.
Ken, I was just going to dive in
please.
real quick, a short point on that, because I completely agree with Noel. But in addition to the safety issues on the workforce, there are liability issues that complicate this problem, as well as all companies are grappling with. Do they mandate vaccinations? Can they mandate vaccinations? If they don't, how does that affect calling workers in, hiring new workers? And it's just a real problem that really delves more into labor law than transportation law. But it's not an easy issue that I know a lot of companies are trying to sort out.
The question that might be a bit for Noel, a bit for Weston. Interesting question comes in from, and it kind of goes to some of the larger topics we've talked about, from Marmy Nelson with High-Sec Labs. She says that they have containers waiting in Long Beach to get loaded onto rail to Atlanta for up to 3 to 4 weeks. When do you see that backlog easing up? And is there anything they can do to get those shipments moving? Obviously, legislation from Congress takes a lot longer than they need to get that moving. They're a small importer, small manufacturer, so don't have quite the same access that a large importer might have. Any thoughts on that, Noel? And then maybe Weston will go to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, we understand the plight of many of our customers, right? What they're experiencing is an anomaly. 3 to 4 weeks is way too long. Earlier on the panel discussion, I talked about container dwell time inside the terminal, and that was primarily for trucks, and Weston can certainly speak to that. But on the rail side, we are also having issues. And again, we have a system that is still adjusting to rapidly shifting market conditions. And we're working with every segment of the supply chain, including our railroads, to make sure that we're aligning our efforts, aligning our equipment, our labor, aligning our business practices to make sure that we remove those containers from the port as soon as possible. And I'm happy to talk to this specific customer. We engage, we get involved, we facilitate conversations. So if they would like to reach out to me, more than happy to follow up with them, make sure that we get those containers to where they're needed.
Thank you, Noel. We don't usually offer those kind of practical solutions on a WITA webinar, but we are delighted to do that here. We'll try to connect you. Those questions we'll get that we don't get to today, we have written up from Zoom, and we can email those to our panelists, and they'll have the contact information. So Marmy, we'll be able to get your information in front of Noel, and maybe you guys can communicate directly after this. Thanks. Weston, it looks like you're ready to jump in.
Yeah, so one additional thing I would say, obviously, I deal with this on the truck side all the time. Trucker can't get it out because there's not enough labor. It gets stacked in a closed area where there's not enough appointments. And in that case, we elevate, we add the FMC in copy, and you'd be surprised how quickly a container becomes available when you have the Federal Maritime Commission in copy and you've elevated above customer service. Rail's a different animal, but one of the things, well, I'd obviously suggest putting it on a truck. It seems to work better. But one of the things I'd look at is, right now, with on-dock rail being congested, you need to look at opportunities to be nimble. And one of the things you can always do with a truck is take it to an inland port, something like Utah. So if it comes into Long Beach, you can grab it, you take it to the Utah inland port, you take it to a rail ramp in downtown LA or in another area, and you can avoid some of the complications that can come right now with on-dock rail. On-dock rail is such a great strategy, but like anything, the works are kind of gummed up, and the rail system, I think, has more issues to unpack because it's not as agile as the trucking infrastructure.
And we had another, Lorianne, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. With Weston talking about the transloading, giving the opportunity and ability, being nimble is key. Right now, people may not realize, but half of the country is buried in snow. So when you've got rail and you've seen the storms that have crippled Texas, the Midwest, up in Chicago, weather is also a factor when it comes to rail. So to Weston's point, you've got to be nimble, and you have to figure out other ways of maybe that transloading, of moving that box another way briefly, if you will, to get to your final destination.
Yeah, and Lori, this kind of dovetails to that. I mean, I guess as I was listening to Weston say that, we often advise our clients, you need to be a little bit of the squeaky wheel. I mean, when you're in a market disruption situation, choices have to be made about what container is going to move where. And, getting in touch, trying to use your contract terms, contacting the FMC, as we heard Weston say, copying them. They do have a very good informal dispute resolution office. It's actually free. You don't have to hire lawyers to use it. That's a good tip for folks to try to do that, because sometimes that squeaky wheel just might get that container sooner than somebody else.
Interesting. Want to pivot a little bit, but also we were talking about the weather delays came up just a second ago. Big hearing yesterday on Capitol Hill about the U.S. Postal Service. Anyone want to jump in here? I'm not sure who to direct this to, but are the problems with the Postal Service something that's being compounded or exacerbating some of the problems that we're seeing at the ports?
Well, I think fundamentally the Postal Service has had a systemic decline over decades because of the use of other types of delivery services. Obviously, email takes away the need for a lot of letters. Almost everything I do now, they say, would you like to opt into electronic only? And then you have companies like UPS, FedEx, Amazon, and many more in local markets for final mile that have become much more prevalent. So I think as cost has gone up with the U.S. Postal Service, people have found cheaper and more efficient ways to deliver packages and cargo. And thus, it may be a time to look at privatizing that market. I'm sorry.
That'll be there's a controversial statement that might come out of the WITA webinar.
I'm used to that.
Following up a little bit though, digging in, and we've mentioned Amazon a couple of times. Are larger organizations like Amazon or Walmart, are they having a different experience at the ports than some smaller retailers that maybe have less bulk going through the various ports and fewer options for shifting where their products may come from?
So yes and no. From our experience, I think everybody's dealing with delays, but when you have more volume of containers, it's less likely that containers are critical. The folks that I find in dire straits are in some cases even American manufacturers. I dealt with one major American manufacturer had 3 critical containers stuck. Think about that, 3 out of how many they're importing. They had to shut down an entire manufacturing plant. So we helped them get those containers out so they could fire it back up. But I think that's the problem that small importers have, is that they don't have, 1, the built-in supply chain, and 2, they also don't have as much volume coming in, so they don't have the ability to trade internally, if you will. The last thing I'd say, and then I know Noel really helped on the store issue, finding that overflow was huge, but we've seen that retailers who have invested in chassis, invested in equipment, have had a much easier time of keeping their supply chain intact than those who have relied on pools and relied on chassis in their ocean freight contracts. So my biggest suggestion, no matter the size of the importer or the exporter, is try to control as much of your supply chain as you can, and that includes the equipment side. A free chassis is going to cost you a lot of money right now.
And Kevin, if I could just add to what Weston said, I agree 100% with what he just said. I mean, that's exactly what some of these big companies are doing. Amazon, they're vertically integrating, they're controlling their own destiny, if you will, ensuring that they have mitigation efforts in place before the crisis hits. The other thing I would add is that some of these big shippers like Walmart, et cetera, they've completely re-engineered their strategy, right? They're no longer reliant on 1 or 2 gateways. They're basically hedging their bets and spreading their risk across. And I think that's helping them. In addition to what Weston said, they're also investing in their own equipment. The last thing I want to say, it's come up already by my colleagues here, really want to thank the Federal Maritime Commission for their leadership in stepping up. I've participated in the supply chain innovation teams that Commissioner Dye has put together. Incredible opportunities to hash these issues out at the highest levels. I'd agree with Nate, right? A lot of these solutions that we're talking about are longer term, but if we put them in place, it will help us better prepare for the situations, for these market disruptions like the one we're going through now.
So we're going to wrap up. We're already right almost at the bewitching hour. So I have one final question that ties in about 3 of the ones that came in online, and then I'm going to go to Lorianne to close us out with some thoughts on this. So we have a lot of U.S. government people who are on the webinar across different agencies. There is obviously there's the COVID relief bill. I don't know if there's anything that has a direct impact on these ports issues there. Infrastructure has been talked about as a major focus. Obviously, the ports are a critical part of the infrastructure. What are we looking for there? And lastly, the Jones Act. Is there any thoughts that anyone wants to make on reforms of the Jones Act that might help going forward? So I think this is sort of for everybody. And then we'll go to Lorianne to close us out. Karyn, do you want to maybe jump in? I know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I think all those things you touched on, except for maybe the Jones Act, from my perspective, absolutely are relevant here and need to be looked at. Maybe an additional piece to that, Ken, is the Shipping Act of 1984, which was amended in 98, but there's a lot of scuttle, I guess I'd say, in the industry about whether that needs to be looked at to better adjust to kind of the changes in the market that have occurred structurally with the ocean carriers and others. But no question, infrastructure reform, look, we've tried to see the last several administrations tackle this. It needs to get done. And the big issue there is who's going to pay for it, right? I mean, that's always the big question. How do you fund it? What do you do with the gas tax, public-private partnerships? All those issues will need to get hashed out, but it really is becoming absolutely critical that infrastructure is a priority with our legislators and the Biden administration.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would jump in. The federal government's role is really to make sure this never happens again. And that's where its major role is. The infrastructure, the bringing everybody together that Noel was talking about, the data sharing that Weston was talking about, and addressing the Shipping Act, as Karyn was talking about. We have, for example, we have 3 alliances for ocean carriers. Yes, there are multiple ocean carriers, but they're down to 3 alliances. Is it time to bring up the antitrust exemption that ocean carriers have? To me, it seems now is the time. So throw another controversial thing, but really the federal government has a role to make sure that this never happens again.
I would agree. Let's not let this crisis go to waste. Let's respond to this in a way that puts us in a position not to have to go through this again.
Yeah, across the board, our industry continues to change, and we need modern policies that reflect how the industry works. At the top of our list is reform of the Shipping Act. The fact that it hasn't been touched since 1998 is unconscionable to me. We need, like I said, reform of internal policies that rely on the Shipping Act, things like the Uniform Intermodal Interchange Agreement. And we need to look at this antitrust immunity that has helped the foreign-owned ocean carriers. And for every efficiency they've seen on the water side, we've seen inefficiencies, multiple of inefficiencies on the land side. And we need to, as an American government, protect American companies and protect American workers from exploitation of foreign-owned ocean carriers. And I've been very vocal on that, and I don't care if that's controversial. We need to maintain our American companies and our American workforce.
Lorianne, you want to take us home?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Bring us to port.
Pretty much. I mean, first off, thanks for having me today. It's been great. But really, when we're talking about this, and when you visualize trade, visualize it as a network of plumbing. So with trade war, you know, it's created elbows where it's diverted containers from one to the other. It's created blockages. With the pandemic, it's had a similar effect, but it has created more sludge, if you will. So the key points here is being nimble, is trying to know as much with your supply chain. When you look at Amazon and when you look at Walmart, they have diversity within their distribution chains. Walmart's actually done better in terms of the flow of their trade than Amazon, but that's because they have way more distribution centers. So I think that's in the end where we have to reflect, recognize what's going on, and then more importantly, figure out what we can do together to make this plumbing flow again.
Well, thank you, Lorianne, Karyn, Noel, Weston, and Nate. Really, really appreciate your helping our membership understand a little bit more about what's going on and some concrete solutions that maybe can be deployed. As I mentioned before, the Q&A, there's quite a few questions we didn't get a chance to get to. We will share those with our panelists, and they can try to get back to folks with that. So thank you again, everybody. Please take care. We hope to welcome our panelists back again, our attendees. Everyone stay safe, wear a mask, and make sure you get the shot when you're eligible to do so. Thanks very much.